You can eat steak every night, you can take a multivitamin every morning, and after 60, your body may still be starving for one specific vitamin, not because it is missing from your plate, because your stomach has quietly stopped being able to pull it out of your food. This is one of the strangest problems in the medicine of aging. The food is right there, the vitamin is right there inside the food, and the body slowly loses the ability to separate the two. You keep eating, you keep believing you are covered, and in the background, over months and years, a shortage builds that almost never announces itself clearly. It shows up as tiredness that everyone calls age. It shows up as a hand that falls asleep at night, and later as a foot that does not quite feel the floor. One honest note before we go further. Everything here is general information, not medical advice for you personally. If any of it sounds familiar, the right move is not to buy something. It is to ask your doctor for a specific test, and I will give you the exact name of that test later in this video, so stay with me. Now let us talk about the lock. The vitamin is B12. Most people think of vitamins as simple things. You swallow it, it enters the blood, the job is done. B12 does not work that way. It is the most complicated vitamin your body handles, and it needs a chain of 3 separate steps to travel from your dinner plate into your nerves. Step 1 happens in the stomach. In food, B12 does not float around freely. It is bound tightly to animal protein, locked inside the meat, the fish, the egg, the liver. To release it, the stomach needs strong acid and an enzyme called pepsin, which only wakes up in an acid environment in the first place. The acid does not digest the vitamin. It cuts the vitamin loose from the protein holding it. Step 2 also happens in the stomach. The stomach wall produces a carrier protein called intrinsic factor. Think of it as an escort. Free B12 on its own would never survive the trip. Intrinsic factor grabs it and carries it down the length of the small intestine. Step 3 happens at the very end of that journey, in the final section of the small intestine called the terminal ileum. There, and almost nowhere else, sit receptors that recognize the escort and pull the pair inside. That is where the vitamin finally enters the blood. 3 steps, and here's the detail that explains nearly everything else in this video. The acid in step 1 and the intrinsic factor in step 2 come from the same cells. They are called parietal cells, and they live in the lining of the stomach. 1 cell, 2 jobs. So when those cells decline, they do not fail one job at a time. They take both down together. The key is fine. The lock is what breaks. So why 60? The answer has a name that sounds worse than it usually feels. Atrophic gastritis. Over decades, the lining of the stomach can thin out, and the parietal cells inside it are gradually lost. Most people who have it never feel a thing. The stomach simply makes less and less acid quietly year after year. A good share of that damage traces back to something that happened long ago. A common bacterium called H. pylori infects an enormous number of people, often in childhood, often without ever causing an ulcer or a single day of discomfort. The immune system fights it for years. The lining takes the damage. Decades later, in a person who has no memory of ever being sick, the acid is gone. Now add the part that affects an enormous number of people watching this. 2 of the most commonly prescribed medicines in the world press on this same system from 2 different directions. The first is metformin, the standard first treatment for type 2 diabetes. It has been used for decades, and it is a good medicine, but it interferes with the final step, the absorption in the terminal ileum, through a mechanism involving calcium at the surface of the intestinal wall. The longer someone takes it and the higher the dose, the more the effect adds up. This is well documented, and it appears in the prescribing information. It is simply something that very often goes unmonitored. The second is the family of acid reducers known as proton pump inhibitors. Omeprazole, pantoprazole, esomeprazole, and the rest of that group. They work extremely well at exactly what they were designed to do, which is shut down stomach acid. But stomach acid is step 1. Suppress it for years, and the release of B12 from food gets suppressed right along with it. Please hear this next part clearly, because it matters more than anything else in this video. Nobody should stop taking either of these medicines because of something they watched on the internet. Metformin protects people from the damage of high blood sugar. Acid reducers protect people from ulcers and from damage to the esophagus. Stopping them can cause real harm. The point is not to quit anything. The point is that if you take one of these, and especially if you take both, this vitamin is worth testing. And that is a conversation to have with your doctor before changing anything. So what does the shortage actually feel like in a real person, in real life? It begins so vaguely that almost nobody connects the dots. Tiredness that sleep does not fix. Getting winded on stairs that were fine last year. At that stage, every one of those things gets filed under getting older, and that filing is exactly why the problem runs unchecked for years. The tongue changes. In a healthy mouth, the surface of the tongue is textured, covered in tiny raised structures. In a long B12 shortage, those can flatten out, and the tongue turns smooth, shiny, oddly red, and often sore or burning, especially with acidic or spicy food. People assume it is a reaction to something they ate. It can be a visible sign of a shortage that started long before. Then the hands and the feet, pins and needles. Numbness in the fingertips, a burning that shows up at night in both feet, usually in a symmetrical pattern. This is not circulation. This is the nerve itself itself. B12 is required to build and maintain myelin, the insulating sheath wrapped around every nerve fiber. Without enough of it, the insulation degrades and the signal starts to leak, and then balance. This is the sign that deserves the most attention, and it is the one people are most likely to wave off. A person walks fine in daylight. In a dark hallway or in the shower with their eyes closed, they feel unsteady and reach for the wall. The reason is precise. The nerve fibers that carry position sense, the ones that tell your brain where your feet are without looking, run in a specific column at the back of the spinal cord, and they are unusually dependent on B12. When they degrade, vision compensates. Take the light away and the compensation disappears. A stumble in the dark in an older adult is not automatically clumsiness, which brings us to the part that changes how families think about this entire subject. Nerves are not only in the hands and the feet. The brain is nerve tissue too. It is affected by the same shortage through the same mechanism, and when it is, the result can look almost exactly like the beginning of dementia. Recent memory goes first. Name slip, a story gets told twice in one afternoon. A person walks into a room and cannot recover why. Then the personality shifts, irritability that is out of character, withdrawal from conversation, a flatness the family reads as depression, sometimes confusion that comes and goes for no obvious reason. Put those together in a 75-year-old, and there is a word every family in the room is already thinking and nobody wants to say out loud. Here is what has to be said carefully and honestly. A B12 shortage is not Alzheimer's disease, and correcting it does not treat Alzheimer's disease. Most cognitive decline in older adults is not caused by this vitamin, but a small and real share of cases that look like early dementia are caused, at least in part, by something in the blood that a simple test can find. And in those cases, when it is found early enough, the picture can improve. That is the reason any of this matters. Not because it is the most common cause, because it is one of the few that is checkable. Of everything that can make an older adult's memory slip, this is one of the very few that can be identified with a blood draw and addressed directly, which is exactly why the standard workup for new memory trouble includes checking it, and why it is completely reasonable for a family to make sure that step actually happened. The word early is carrying the weight in that sentence. Nerve damage that has run for years may only partly recover. Damage caught in the first months usually does much better. The shortage takes its time. That is not a reason to take yours. There is one more trap, and it is the reason a person can have this problem for years while their blood tests keep coming back fine. For a long time, the classic way this got caught was through anemia. Without enough B12, red blood cells come out too large and too few. A routine blood count would show it and the cause would surface. Then folic acid arrived in the food supply. Many countries began adding it to flour, bread, pasta, and breakfast cereal to prevent serious birth defects. It worked, and it spared a great many children, but it created a side effect nobody planned for. Folic acid can push red blood cell production forward even when B12 is missing, so the blood count normalizes. The cells look ordinary. The anemia never appears, or it appears so late that it is useless as a warning, and the nerves get none of that help. Folic acid does nothing for myelin, so the alarm bell goes quiet while the fire keeps burning. In practice, this means a person can eat fortified cereal every single morning, show a perfectly normal blood count year after year, and still be losing the insulation on their nerves the entire time. A normal blood count does not rule this out. If you take one thing from this video, take that. So what do you actually ask for? Start with the obvious one, a serum B12 test. It is cheap, it is available everywhere, and it is a reasonable place to begin, but it is an imperfect test, and you should know why before you lean on it. Serum B12 measures the total amount circulating in the blood, and a large part of that total is bound to a carrier protein that will not release it to the tissues, so the number can look acceptable while the amount actually reaching your cells is not. There is also a wide gray zone in the reference range where the result is neither clearly normal nor clearly low, and that is exactly where a lot of older adults land. That is why two other tests matter. The first is methylmalonic acid, usually written as MMA. The second is homocysteine. Both are substances the body cannot process properly without enough B12 working at the level of the cell. When the vitamin is functionally short, both tend to rise, and they rise before the standard test looks abnormal and before permanent damage is done. They measure whether the vitamin is doing its job, not merely whether it is present. If a shortage is confirmed, the treatment is usually simpler than people expect. The old assumption was injections for life. Injections are still used, and in some situations they are the right choice, but in most cases, high-dose tablets taken by mouth work just as well. Alongside the escort system, a small fraction of B12, roughly 1%, crosses the intestinal wall by simple passive diffusion with no intrinsic factor involved at all. 1% is nothing when the dose is small. Make the dose large enough, and that 1% becomes plenty, which means a stomach that has stopped stopped producing acid and intrinsic factor entirely can still be supplied through the mouth with a tablet. The dose and the form are decisions for your doctor to make with your results in hand, not decisions to make from a shelf in a store. So here is where all of this lands. This is not about eating better. It is about whether your body can still open the door. And the only way to know is to ask for the right test. If you are past 60, if you take metformin or a long-term acid reducer, if you eat little or no animal protein, or if anyone in your family has dealt with this, ask. Ask for the serum level, and ask whether methylmalonic acid or homocysteine should be checked alongside it. It is one blood draw, and of all the things that can quietly go wrong in an aging body, this is one of the few that is both easy to find and, when found in time, largely fixable. One last thing before you go. B12 is the one that gets mistaken for age most often, but there is a mineral that almost never gets tested at all, that is involved in more than 300 reactions in the body, and that ordinary blood tests are nearly blind to because almost none of it is in the blood in the first place. That one is magnesium.